Good morning. I'm Lisa Brush with the Stewardship Network, and really pleased to be here with Mike Kost and Ann Garwood and Amy Lowndes from Michigan's Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy to host this workshop on rare communities of Michigan. So again, I want to welcome you. I want to tell you just a little bit about the Stewardship Network. We've been pleased to be partnering with EGLE on this Michigan's Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, also known as EGLE, to host this wetlands workshop series that we've been doing. And so this is one in a series. Pleased to be talking about rare communities in Michigan. The Stewardship Network is a 501c3 nonprofit. Our mission is to connect, equip, and mobilize people and organizations to care for land and water in their communities. We've been around for 20 years with an international and national award-winning model for how to care for land and water in your communities. We have 20 geographically place-based member communities that do on-the-ground collaborative stewardship and learning and engagement, offering workshops and networking opportunities. Rob has dropped into the chat the workshop series. You can see the number of workshops that we've done in this series and the other ones that are coming up. As I said, we're really proud to present this series with our partners at EGLE. So the upcoming workshops, this one's kicking off the final round of this workshop series. The final 5 of them will take place in September. They're all about wetland protection. So wetland protection for homeowners as well as kind of local officials. And so take a look at the stewardshipnetwork.org/EGLE to learn more about them and to register for them. And a special thanks to Michigan Wetlands Association for their support in this whole series. And you can look forward to more in the fall about wetlands that will be coming up that we'll be working with Michigan Wetlands Association and EGLE on as well. As I said, I'm Lisa Brush here with the Stewardship Network and really pleased to be here with Mike Kost. Mike has a long and storied history as an amazing ecologist. He is currently an associate curator at Mathi Botanical Gardens in Nichols Arboretum. He is also a lecturer at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability, also known as SEAS. And he was formerly a lead ecologist with the Michigan Natural Features Inventory. So again, Mike, thank you. Welcome. We're pleased to have you here. Appreciate you spending the next couple hours together. I want to encourage you all online to use the chat and the Q&A liberally. We'll be keeping track of those questions that come in. We've got 3 hours that we'll spend together. Mike will tell us a little bit about. We plan to take a couple breaks in there so that you all can get up and stretch your legs and get some water. And with that, Mike, I'm going to let you take it away.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Lisa. And I want to thank the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, and the Stewardship Network and the Michigan Wetlands Association for the opportunity to talk about rare wetlands and wetlands in general, which is one of my favorite subjects in the world. So it's great to be able to do this with you all. And I want to thank you all for showing up today and caring enough to show up. It's tremendously important that you're here and that we're sharing in this exploration of Michigan wetlands. So I want to tell you a little bit about what we're going to be doing today. We're going to have the first session. So we'll be essentially 3 main sessions. The first will be an introduction to wetlands, covering some of the landscape context, and then how to think about wetlands from a conservation standpoint. So that will take a 10-minute break about 9:50 and come back at 10, and we'll cover a series of non-forested wetlands. We'll go through community by community. We'll work our way through that, and we'll take another break at 10:50 and 10 to 11 and come back at 11, so that we'll stay on the whole time, but that will be my breaks, and I think you'll need a break as well. So and we'll finish up, I believe we'll finish up at noon. So that's the plan for today. And I'm going to jump into the material. You'll have opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session, but also if it's something really urgent, it's going to really help out to answer it during the session. Feel free to jump in and ask a question in the chat, and then I think Lisa will flag me because I'll be focused on the material and I won't be able to focus on material and chat. I haven't mastered that in 2 years of Zoom. I still haven't mastered speaking and paying attention to the chat.
That's legit, right?
Lots of people have, but I get too excited and too into what I'm doing. So So, all right, so let's jump in. I'm going to share my screen, which hopefully will be easy to do. And let me see where those controls are. Okay. All right, you should be seeing my screen, and I'm going to go into presenter mode.
It looks great, Mike.
Okay. And okay, so we'll focus on rare communities, but we're going to begin with an introduction to natural communities, to essentially wetlands in general. So all the material I'm presenting today, or much of the material I should say, is available online and through various resources. Much of it's available through Michigan Natural Features Inventory, and I have their website there. You can type that in to Google, and if you type in natural communities along with that search term, you'll find a series of web pages. The report on the left we did in 2007, and that's a 300 and some odd page report covering each of the natural communities in detail. That information is also pasted into the website where it describes each of the natural communities. But what's nice about the website, it gives you links to other resources as well as lots of pictures, and the plant lists. You can access the plant list through there as well. But pictures are 1,000 words, right? So it's really nice to have pictures. The book in the center is available through Amazon.com. It's a brief description of each of the natural communities along with plant lists and lots of beautiful pictures. And then we've done five books on various components, or including the field guide, other communities like the Prairie Fen book that are available through Michigan Natural Features Inventory. And then a series of abstracts. I think we've done abstracts for each of the wetland communities, but we've done 55 altogether, but we focus primarily on the wetlands. And those are anywhere from 5 to 20 some odd pages on an individual community type and really cover in detail. And they're great. I use them. I use all these materials in my course, where my course focuses on the natural communities and the plants within them. So, okay. So I want to give a definition of a natural community. So a natural community is defined as an assemblage of interacting plants, animals, and other organisms that repeatedly occurs under similar environmental conditions across the landscape and is predominantly structured by natural processes rather than anthropogenic disturbances. So what we see, so if you learn to identify a few plants and get around the landscape, you'll begin to see that you're seeing the same species show up, same plants and animals show up in the same types of environmental conditions. And that repeatability is how we kind of structure this idea of a natural community. And we're not and where we talk about anthropogenic disturbances versus natural processes, this is to try to separate that out from a pine plantation, from a natural pine grove, or a some other system that's man-made rather than something that occurs naturally on its own in the landscape. And I don't mean that it exists always without any management. Native Americans used fire, and land managers have continued to use fire, and fire occurs by itself too, and that really structures. So that's a natural process that structures ecosystems. And whether it's prescribed or natural, it's still, we're using that natural process of fire to introduce that process. Okay, so wetlands are defined using 3 primary criteria: soils, vegetation, and hydrology. And we're going to discuss each of those in a little bit, but those are really 3 primary things when we talk about wetlands, and how do we know something is a wetland or not a wetland. It's got wetland soils, wetland vegetation, and it's got the hydrologic signature.
Hey, Mike, you've gone out of presentation mode.
Oh, thank you.
Yep.
Okay.
There we go. Okay.
Great,
Yep.
thanks. Okay, so there's many factors that structure the distribution of natural communities. but there's 5 primary ones that I want to address a little bit in this introduction. Climate, geology, topographic, position where something is on the landscape, the soils or substrate, because certainly Michigan has bedrock systems that don't have soil, but mostly what we're talking about is soil. And in this context of wetlands, we're looking at organic soil as well as mineral soil. And then natural disturbance, things like fire and lightning strikes and wind throw and snap off and seasonal flooding and beaver flooding and groundwater seepage and ice storms and so on and so forth. So natural disturbances that are part of ecosystems. If you remove those natural disturbances, the ecosystem can shift away from, can move to a different state, to a different natural community sometimes. So those natural disturbances are inherent part of an ecosystem. So beginning with climate, we know that there's 3 major air masses moving across the continent that affect the climate across the Great Lakes states. And here you could see, I think you can see my cursor here, but this is a floristic tension zone, or what we refer to as the tension zone, where north of this zone, we tend to have a predominance of conifers. And we all know this, as you go north, you know, at some point you get out of your car and you smell pines, and it smells different. And the air is wonderful, and it's got this conifer smell to it, and that's where we see our pines. So that's really lots of species reach their northern and southern range limits along that tension zone. So you'll hear me referring to the tension zone, and that's what I'm referring to. I'm referring to this climatic break. We also know that there's regional climatic differences that really affect plant communities. And we find colder temperatures and increased moisture along the Great Lakes shorelines, and then high elevation areas tend to be colder. So the high plains area, this is an area of deep sands and hills, but it's a high plateau of sand. And in the Western UP, we find that those areas in these moraines in the base of an old mountain range and loaded with moraines on top of it. So that those areas are high elevation, tend to be colder, and that affects the plant communities as well. Geology, Michigan, almost the whole, with the whole state was completely covered by glaciers. As the glaciers moved out, they left a series of moraines, and then the water issuing forth from the melting glaciers blanketed the landscape with primarily lots of sand and gravel. And those sand plains are outwash plains, and they often have sometimes loaded with ice block depressions, ice blocks that got stranded from the main branch of the ice. And then because they were stranded and the glacier kept melting back, issuing sand, many of those were buried and created depressions. So that's a process. We refer to those as kettles, kettle lakes, kettle bogs, or ice block depressions. And they can be wet or dry. And sometimes landscapes are loaded with them. If you're ever in the Brighton area, Brighton, Michigan area, you'll see the expressways run right through, right adjacent to lots of little lakes. This area is what we call pitted outwash, lots of lakes. How did those lakes form? Well, they formed by ice blocks getting stranded from the main glacier, and then sand issuing forth, creating these outwash plains, but the ice blocks got buried, and when those bottom of the ice block is in contact with water, then you'll have a lake or some type of wetland that will then wetlands, which primarily probably started as a lake and filled with vegetation. Could be shallow, could be deep, but they're the bottom of those depressions are in contact with groundwater. And the ice blocks, how big? Well, they could range from the size of your house to the size of a city. They can be huge, and they break off. And when they're huge, like the size of a city, they break off. They're full of all the gravel, and you have lots of these ice block depressions, but you also have adjacent hills from all the material from that chunk of ice breaking up. And we call those areas where we have this kettle came topography, came being the hills, kettles being the depressions. We call that kettle, we can call it kettle came topography, but it's also referred to as ice contact. And so you'll hear me ice contact topography. So sometimes you'll hear me use that term. Okay, so what does this look like in reality? Or or maybe not in reality, but on a map visualized. This was a map made by Farron and Bell, and to map the various outwash plains and moraines and a lake plain in Michigan. And this blue area was covered by Lake Huron, by Lake Erie, by Lake Michigan, by Lake Superior in some places. And so we refer to that as lake plain. And it's got, in some areas, it's loaded with clay. There's also old beach ridges, sand beach ridges in there as well. The browns and the greens are moraines, and the moraines could be coarse textured, like full of sand and gravel, or fine textured, full of clay. And that makes a big difference in what plant communities will be there. And then the salmon color is outwash, these outwash plains, which I talked about. And the pink are these ice contact kettle cane topography, very hilly. So if we compare the surficial geology map to the digital elevation map, we can see the high plains area in northern lower Michigan, very droughty. It's very high elevation. There's lots of wetlands there as well, but this deep sands. And so that's where our pine barrens are, and and those sands are acidic, and some of our lots of bogs and poor fens, which I'll talk about later. And then another hilly area here. This is what I'll refer to as the inner lobate region. There was a lobe of the glacier coming through Saginaw Bay, a lobe coming through Lake Erie, and they met, or they and deposited a series of moraines, and that's what we're seeing as hills. And then all the water issuing forth from those moraines are the lobes of the glacier that stood still, dropped their moraines, and then issued lots of water into outwash plains. And there's lots of lakes and wetlands in here in this large outwash plain here. Okay, and in the UP, just to give you an idea, a similar thing, but lots of lake plain, this blue color in the eastern UP and outwash plains. And so we have tremendous, huge wetlands in the eastern UP, very level. And in the western UP, like I said, base of an old mountain range, but also moraines on top of it. So high elevation, cold in the winter. And the bedrock geology is really different between the western UP and the rest of the state. We've got the granitic, the Cambrian, Precambrian shield granitic rocks here. And in the eastern UP, and especially northern lower, we have limestone close to the surface, dolomite and limestone close to the surface. Those are full of calcium carbonates and magnesium carbonates. So the soils tend to be very high in alkalinity, with some areas of exposed bedrock up in the eastern UP and northeastern lower peninsula. So how does this affect wetlands? Well, wetlands occur on all glacial landforms, but they're especially prevalent at the bases. They're very common in the bottom of depressions when it's in contact with the groundwater. And then lots of seeps and springs occur along the bases of moraines and ice contact features, these eskers and kames, these hilly landscapes. Wetlands are also common in areas where there's lots of clay at the surface, or where the soil, the upper layer, is underlain by clay. Clay, as we know, impedes drainage. So the lake plain in particular, especially in southern Michigan, had tremendous amounts, well, in the eastern UP had tremendous amounts of wetlands, but in the lower peninsula, in the southeast corner of the state and Saginaw Bay, deep clays, and consequently lots of wetlands. And then in outwash channels, and I didn't mention this earlier, but outwash channels, so where we see, here's a recessional moraine, a terminal moraine, or an end moraine. So these are moraines that were laid down by the glacier, but there's so much water issuing forth, it busted through the moraine and created an outwash channel. And it looks small here, but this moraine could be 5, 10, 20 miles wide, could be wide. And so cutting through those are those outwash channels. That's where our rivers run, in the outwash channels. Our present day rivers run in those outwash channels. And they're full of, that's where we have lots of wetlands because that's a zone of seepage. Okay, and soils are another another component, another characteristic that really structures the distribution of ecosystems around the state. And in terms of wetlands, I've done ecological surveys for many, many years. And even my master's thesis was in wetlands, and always digging, carrying a soil probe, always looking at soils. And I'm still fascinated by soils, but there's certain attributes that you find over and over again in wetlands. And one of them is this iron modeling color. And you can see it here overlain by a very dark upper soil horizon. And it's dark black because it's got lots of organics, and the organics, the plant, the material, the organics are composed of partially decomposed plant matter. So this is a mineral soil, but there's lots of black in it because there's lots of plant matter in it that didn't get decomposed. It didn't get decomposed partly because the prevalence of water in that, and the water, in other words, under anaerobic conditions where there's not enough oxygen, the bacteria can't break down the plant matter, so it tends to build up, and that's what we see in organic soils. The organic soils are just primarily composed of broken down plant matter, but only so broken down. It's only very partially broken down because of the lack of bacteria, and we see these black soils above this iron modeled. You can see the iron and it's starting to run, and it's starting to run here. And that's what happens when you have fluctuating water levels. It really changes the soil, what the soil looks like. And you can even get, and this is actually really common, especially where there's lots of clay, these glade, all the iron leaches out and it ends up being a gray, it looks gray. And so that's a gray, or what's called glade soil, and some people call them blue clays, but it can be, you can see that color in sand as well, in wetlands. You can see gray color in other soil horizons that are in dry conditions, but like I said, for wetlands, we're looking at not just the soils, but we're also looking at the plant community, the plants that are growing in there. Are they what we refer to as hydrophytes? Are they wetland plants? And and hydrology is their presence of water. So those three things together, and you can use all three to help you understand that, yes, this is a wetland. Okay, so staying on soils for just a minute, soil texture is something, so we call things a sandy clay, or a loam, or a sandy clay loam, or a clay. And that's based on the percentage of sand, silt, and clay, which then brings it to silty clay if it has so much silt and so much clay. And wetlands occur on all soil types. Because why on all soil types? Because it's not just the soil, it's really the water table. Is the water table in contact with the surface, or close enough to the surface, or is it in contact with the surface or flooding, inundating the surface for a portion of the year or long enough to sustain wetland plants and leave its mark in the soil. And as I said earlier, clay certainly impedes drainage. So it might not be right at the surface. It could be, foot under the surface, six inches under the surface. The other factor that really structures plant communities is the pH of the soil. Now, pH is a measure of hydrogen ions, and plants, ecosystems generally are from about 4 till 8 pH, right in that range. This being very 7 to 8. 7 is considered neutral, but as far as plant communities go, after about 7.4, we start seeing a pretty big change in who can live there, who can eke it out, because nutrients become less available at high pHs, and the same with low pHs. So the ericaceous shrubs, you'll hear me say that, that's in the family Ericaceae. Those are the cranberries and the blueberries and bog rosemaries and many other low shrubs that are common in bogs. They do fine. Cranberries, blueberries love those acidic conditions of about 4.5, 5. So they really like those this is referred to extremely acidic at 4.5 and below. But so other plants can exist. So it really influences the plant community. Okay, so natural disturbances in wetland. There's many. Fluctuating water levels. Many of our wetlands do have those fluctuating water levels on a year-to-year basis, and as seasonally. So from wet in the spring, dry later in the summer, and fall, or in some years, as we all know, we have wetter years, so they might be wet all year long, or water at the surface all year long. Drought and fire and wind throw and snap off when the top of a tree snaps off, ice storms, insect outbreaks, and that especially affects our tamarack and spruce, our rich tamarack swamps and poor conifer swamps, or black spruce bogs. Beaver are, they're ecosystem engineers. They're extremely important to creating new wetland habitat, large mammal feeding and muskrat lodges, trails, and birds and all their bird nesting and ant mounds. All these are natural disturbances that are part of ecosystems, and beaver in particularly are significant because they expand the acreage of wetlands. They create dams, flood areas, and they also eat the surrounding vegetation, the trees. They knock down the trees and the willows, and use the willows for feeding in the winter. Especially they'll create these cache piles of food, and so through woody or rivery and girdling trees and flooding, they create new habitats. So and I think they're underappreciated for that. They're the early accounts of people coming into this land and describing it talked, there were just an abundance of beaver along all the rivers and creeks. Okay, so landscape context. When we look at wetlands in a bigger picture, I'm going to be talking about wetlands as if they're each individual communities, and it's a great way to understand them. But really, they coexist together with the uplands as well. And so this aerial image, or air photo, you can see this creek moving through there, and there's probably submerged vegetation in there, and that would be a submergent marsh. And there's probably there are probably bulrushes coming out along the shore or in portions of these, and we would consider that an emergent marsh. And all of this, this tone here is probably dominated by sedges. So it's a sedge meadow or wet meadow. And this texture here is probably some type of shrubby wetlands. Could be an alder thicket, what we call a northern shrub thicket, or it might be a southern shrub car, willow dominated by willow and dogwoods. And then you can see the conifers. This could be a poor conifer swamp or a rich conifer swamp, cedar swamp or black spruce. And so they occur together, and so we're going to be talking about individual wetlands, but just keep in mind that many of these communities occur as part of a large wetland complex. The landscape complex we refer kind of colloquially as landscape complex, but in particular wetland complex. And so this is really what this a diagram of this. You may have a lake or a large river system with submergent vegetation in it, grading to emergent vegetation. So we would call this submergent marsh, emergent marsh, wet meadow, and then shrub system, and then swamp forest, and so on and so forth. And I'm not going to talk about it today, but the uplands make a huge difference of what we see there. They're also part of that landscape complex. So we're here today partly because we're concerned about wetlands, and rightly so. The United States has lost a tremendous amount of wetlands over the last since the 1700s, and you can see Michigan lost about 50% of their wetlands, and some states up to 80% of the wetlands have been drained. So it's a national issue of concern. And in Michigan, as I said, we've lost about 50% of our wetlands, or about 4.2 million acres, and it's not distributed equally, as you can see. That lake plain area in southeast Michigan and Saginaw Bay, predominantly clay lake plain, also sand in many places too, but predominantly clay. And that's been drained and developed, or turned into agriculture where it's drained. So it's not an even thing statewide. But what was most affected? Well, there's been a statewide loss of conifer swamps, and that's cedar swamps and tamarack swamps, and an increase statewide in shrub swamps, in shrubby wetlands. In the northern lower and upper peninsula, there's been an overall increase as a percentage of wetlands of hardwood swamp. And in southern Michigan, in addition to losing the conifer swamps, or really reducing the amount of conifer swamps, we've lost many of our emergent wetlands, our wet prairies, especially our wet meadows and our fens, but probably especially the wet prairies that occur on mineral soil that are perfect for farming as well and can be easily drained. So conservation strategies to protect wetlands would be to identify and protect and manage for biodiversity protection. So in other words, identify, protect, and manage for biodiversity conservation. Large, high quality examples of each wetland in each ecoregion. So on the right part of the screen, you'll see Denny Albert's landscape ecoregions of Michigan, with 4 major ecoregions, then some divided. Ideally, if we were going to protect bog or wet prairie or a poor conifer swamp or whatever it might be, we have multiple examples in each ecoregion that are good examples, that are the best we could find, and we protect them across the state so that we have regional variation, because these communities do vary regionally. We protect groundwater recharge areas and groundwater discharge areas. We create sufficient upland and wetland buffers to protect the wetland recharge areas and allow for a shifting mosaic of wetland types. So I put up these diagrams, I'll put up some more, but you can see that, you know, depending on if it's a series of wet years or series of dry years or beaver flood in the area or some other change, these communities don't always just stand still. So to allow that shifting mosaic to occur is important. So we protect enough land around wetlands. Establishing natural landscape corridors to connect isolated patches, isolated wetland patches, to allow for genetic exchange. And reintroducing fire to open wetlands and surrounding uplands such as oak and pine forests to create open landscapes. So for example, turtles come out of ponds, they're looking for a sunny place to lay their eggs. In the absence of fire, they have a hard time finding those, and the females keep moving, and sometimes they get hit by cars as they're crossing roads. We need to have, in fire dependent landscapes where oak and pine are dominant in the uplands, we need to make sure that we're keeping portions of that landscape open in terms of, to create savannas and prairies and open pine forests and oak forests, so, or what we call oak woodlands. And reducing deer density in urban areas. So in the Ann Arbor area, for example, we have very high deer densities, and we see its impact on plant diversity. It's really striking to see that. And so we need to reduce deer densities to allow for plant diversity. Reintroducing missing plant species, reintroducing or at least allowing keystone animal species, especially beaver, were ecologically and socially feasible. Seed banking seeds of rare plants to safeguard against this extinction, and then incorporating wetland plants into landscaping and rain gardens were all important conservation strategies.
Mike, and as we're talking about conservation strategies, Jeff asked the question of, is the increase in shrub swamps driven by a lack of disturbance, fire, and colonization by invasives like buckthorn?
Yes and yes, but that's regional. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so buckthorn has changed the game, especially glossy buckthorn. I've even seen it take over bogs. So yeah, poor conifer swamps, black spruce bogs. Yeah, certainly, but you know, that's spreading mainly in urban areas and up in Seney where it was planted. So it's not in bad some parts of the states, it's worse than others. But in general, when you cut down trees, you know, that they succeed slow and surely. We move the conifers, and shrub swamps come in first, then hardwood swamps will come in typically. But so there's been an increase partly because of that. There is another major increase of shrubs after World War II. What happened was the advent of refrigeration. So after World War II, people started having refrigerators, electric refrigerators. Before that, like my father, he doesn't call a refrigerator, he always calls it an ice box, because when he grew up, the Iceman came down the street and sold a block of ice. Where did those blocks of ice come from? Lakes. They got cut out of lakes, stored in barns. what did they get stored with? Marsh hay. So if you look at their photos from the 1937, almost all the wetlands in southern Michigan were cut and mowed for marsh hay. Marsh hay was used to insulate ice blocks. And so it was also used for animal, not fodder, but for like bedding for animals too. So it was a regular practice to mow the marshes, to mow the wetlands, and that kept them up and open. And after World War II, Keith White wrote a paper about this in 1960, I think 1964 in Ecology. And he described this whole process really well in a paper on southern shrub cars. In Ecology. But yeah, so that's one of the other reasons. So we stopped mowing and it just turned into shrubs, and that's another reason why. That's probably the primarily in any agricultural area, even northern lower, that's in parts of the UP.
Fascinating. Thanks for that. And Robin and Angie, we see your hands are raised, and go ahead and type it into the chat. And then another question that John asks is, what about the trend of increase in hardwood swamps you've referred to a few slides back? Do you see that trend reversing due to emerald ash borer? There's been
but it's
central UP recently.
Yeah, to a certain extent. So you know, once an area becomes hardwood swamp, it tends to stay. And so the ash, what we have a northern system that was dominated, northern hardwood, that was dominated by ash, and so the ash is gone. But what's replaced it are the maples. So many places red maple, sometimes silver maple, but there's a lot of wetland trees, you know, in southern Michigan, sycamore and many others. So those hardwood swamps haven't really changed from hardwood swamps. And once an area becomes hardwood swamp, it's hard for it to move away from that right now, even with the presence of missing elm and emerald ash borer. The only thing that really seems to work is that changed that is flooding, and in particular beaver. So those are our agents for change. Yeah.
Good. Thanks for that.
Yep. All right. So wetland conservation strategies, to continue with that, I just want to talk about recharge areas and discharge areas to give you a couple of visuals. So the uplands, I mentioned, it's, you know, we can't just protect the wetland. That's great, but ideally we protect the adjacent upland as well, because those are where water seeps in and into the ground and then comes out at the base and those outwash channels in the bottoms of streams, in the bottoms of lakes. It comes out in our wetlands. So, but protecting that recharge area is also important. And to give you another visual of that, you can see that water seeping out at the base of this hill here. And in Michigan, this would be a moraine, because our hills are generally ice contact features like like cames or eskers or normally moraines. And the other thing I want to point out that I think does a nice visual is the water table isn't stagnant. It's not like the same elevation across the state. It moves. If you're going up a hill, the water table slowly rises up that hill as well. So these hills you can think of as like camel's backs. They're full of water. It might be deeper to hit that water in the hill than it is at the bottom, but nonetheless, the water table rises with the hills and comes out at the base in forms of springs and seeps. Okay, so covering natural communities. MNFI, we've classified 77 natural communities. The natural communities we call elements, so everything that's tracked by Michigan Natural Features Inventory, which is rare plants, rare animals, and natural community. Each one of those is an element that's tracked, and there are 32 wetland communities, one community, that wooded dune and swale complex, that is a complex of upland old abandoned beach ridges interspersed with low swales. That's along the Great Lakes shoreline, and that support the swales support wetlands, and the uplands usually support pines. And then 42 terrestrial communities and 2 subterranean sink communities. And there's a link there to Michigan Natural Features Inventory where you can get information on each of those. And how is rarity assessed? Rarity is assessed based on the number of high quality examples, how many we have in the state. And this is, just so you know, Michigan Natural Features Inventory is part of a national, actually international network of state natural heritage programs. And in Canada, they're called conservation data centers. And together there's a network, an organization called NatureServe that serves as the clearinghouse for all of this information. NatureServe takes all the information from the states and sets a global rank, and Michigan Natural Features Inventory uses their information, as same thing with the heritage program in all the states, use their information to assess, to assign a rank based on how many we found, and based on the inventory, how many else we think are out there that necessarily we haven't found but would be out there. So we see this S1, G1 being the rarest, down to S5 being secure or globally secure or state secured. So and when we talk about rare, rare is considered S1, S2, S3, G1, G2, G3. But you'll hear the term rare and imperiled. So we're talking S2 and S1, rare and imperiled. So those are the terms. And in terms of, so I mentioned that each natural community is an element, and then each element, each occurrence of a natural community is assigned a rank, from A being the highest to D being the lowest. And the evaluation criteria are size, so generally larger occurrences are ranked higher. Landscape context, that has to do with viability. In other words, if the landscape context of the community is surrounded by other natural communities or other natural ecosystems, it will receive a higher rank than if it's adjacent to a subdivision that maybe people are planting invasive species and they're drawing water, and their septic tanks are leaking sewage into the wetland, or shopping centers or urban areas. So it's the landscape context that's taken into consideration there, and that has to do with what is the viability of this element, and then the condition. And condition are the species there? Is it predominantly native species, few invasives? Are there invasives present? Has there been other natural disturbances that recently been cut or drained or impacted in other ways? What's the condition of that? So those criteria are used to assign a rank of A through D to every element, to every natural community occurrence. And the high quality ones, A and B ranks, are what's used to assess that conservation rank, which is that S1, S2, S3, S4 for state critically imperiled, state imperiled, and so forth. Okay, and here's a list of the natural communities and their associated ranks. In purple are the rare wetlands. These are the wetland. These are the wetlands, and you can see the rare wetlands listed there. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm happy to answer questions for a bit, and then I'm going to take a break and come back at 10. So, and I'll stop sharing my screen hold on. Okay. All right. So, so I'm not, Lisa isn't asking, am I good?
You're good. That's
okay.
Great, Mike.
I'll see you guys.
What a great run through, and totally what a pleasure to just listen to you wax poetic about all the amazing wetlands and features of the landscape. So thanks so much.
All right. Is it 9:40? Okay, it's 9:40.
Yeah.
I have a clock in front of me that says 10:52, so I thought I was like right on it. Okay.
Yeah, but it's great. We'll come back at the top of the hour.
Okay. All right. Thanks. All right.
Okay, great. And folks, okay, great. We'll ask Mike about, hey, Mike, here's one little suggestion from somebody who asked if you can change your cursor to a highlighter using the controls on your screen, and it should be in the lower corner, he says. See if you can figure that out in the next.
Does anybody want to tell me how to do that at lower corner? I'm not sure what.
I know, I'm not quite sure either.
I don't know how to do that. I made it
let's see, maybe Rob and I will troubleshoot on that, and Steve, maybe type in a little more specific instructions, and we'll get you figured out. I think that's a great suggestion. And Mike, Bobby says, I agree with Lisa. Mike is such a great speaker and has vast knowledge in this area. So
thanks, Bobby. I appreciate you being here.
Yeah. Okay. We'll be
Okay.
back at the top of the hour, and
Okay.
feel free in the meantime, folks, if you want to chat among yourselves, share a favorite wetland story that you have or a question that you have, and we'll bring those back at the top of the hour. But feel free to get up and walk around a little bit, stretch, and we'll be back at the top of the hour.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, welcome back. During this next 50 minutes, we'll be talking about non-forested wetlands and focusing primarily on the rare ones, but we'll cover some of the others that are important because these wetlands don't occur just as isolated things, right? They occur, these community types occur together. Here we're looking at a Great Lakes marsh. And these have been described as I've mentioned by Michigan Natural Features Inventory. Myself and my colleagues, I should say my colleagues and I, my former colleagues and I, described these systems in a series of publications, books and reports, and natural community abstracts, and a very comprehensive website where all of this information is available. So please take advantage of that. We went through ranking, but I didn't know how far we'd get. So here are the wetland natural communities, which we looked at before, and we're going to jump into the first one we'll cover is Great Lakes Marsh, which occurs along the shores of the Great Lakes. It's dominated by herbaceous plants, and it's also the buried river mouths it'll occur in. In other words, it'll come up the coast a little bit, and the connecting channels too. So the St. Mary's and River and the Detroit River, the marshes on there along there are referred to as Great Lakes Marsh. And it's got several zones in it, and it's very much structured by the changes in lake level and the local shoreline configuration. In other words, if it's behind a sand spit or in a protected embayment, it influences the vegetation and the development of that marsh. And it's typically got several zones. So here we're looking at Duck Bay up in the eastern UP in a protected embayment, and we see the development here of this Great Lakes marsh in this bay. But as I mentioned, it occurs along connecting channels and where tributaries enter the Great Lakes. We refer to those as buried river mouths because the water from the Great Lakes has buried the mouth of the river, and the marsh migrates up. So it will include multiple zones, and those zones are also for natural communities in their own right. So submergent marsh will be where the vegetation is submerged, emergent marsh, and this is Duck Bay again, and on Marquette Island in the eastern UP. And you can see a shrub swamp, a wet meadow, shrub zone, and a cedar swamp, adjacent cedar swamp in this diagram that Denny Albert drew. Submergent marsh, so Great Lakes Marsh has submergent marshes as part of it, and that's where the vegetation, submergent marsh occurs in deep to shallow lakes and streams throughout the Midwest and Northeast in Canada and throughout the state of Michigan. And it is typically transitions to emergent marsh along the shoreline. So here we see vegetation coming out of the water, emerging, thus emergent marsh. And here we see it floating. It has it's unranked. It hasn't been assigned a rank globally, and is considered apparently secure in the state of Michigan. So submergent marsh includes submerged plants, floating plants, and floating leaved plants like the water lilies, and floating plants. So we see this submerged marsh here coming up into an emergent marsh here. And it's got a lot of species that we see in submergent marsh only when we're fishing and we bring them up to identify them. So the emergent marsh is also unranked globally and apparently secure, and it's part of a Great Lakes marsh. It's a zone, and it's a community that is herbaceous community in shallow water, occurring on the shores of lakes and streams throughout the Midwest and Northeast and throughout Michigan. And typically it'll support water throughout most of the growing season in most years. And bulrush is one of the, if you see bulrush, you're probably in a emergent marsh. That's that long, like straw-like plant, right? That thin, tall plant, but it's got a really broad diversity of plants that occur in it. And emergent marsh is part of lots of, it's a component of most wetland complexes. And when we map natural communities, emergent marsh is right there on many of them. Wet meadow is part of so the wet meadow zone of a Great Lakes marsh is the wet meadow is part of a Great Lakes marsh where it's along the coast, but we find this community frequently along river channels and in many outwash plains, occupying pretty good sized areas. We have two types of wet meadow, or two. We separate the northern from the southern. It's a little bit different floristically, botanically, so a little bit different plants. In the north, it's considered secure in the state, or apparently secure in the state, an S4. And in the south, it's considered vulnerable, S3, which is a rare community. And it's groundwater influence. So the water is seeping out from the ground as they do in many of our wetlands, or almost all of our wetlands. And they're sedge dominated, occurring throughout the Midwest and Northeast US and Canada. And tussock sedge is what really structured. Many of those are structured. Many of the wet meadows are dominated by Carex stricta, not exclusively, and there'll be many other sedges present. And sometimes some of the others will be dominant, but Carex stricta is a tussock forming. It's a pedestal. Many of you have walked across wetlands and found yourself tripping. You're usually tripping over and bumping into these pedestals of Carex stricta that are elevated above the zone of flooding. At least the tops sometimes are, and with water in between them. And those tussocks support Carex stricta. They're composed of the roots of Carex stricta, but they support many other plants, little violets and bugle weeds and lots of other species you'll find on the tops of those tussocks growing right with the sedge. And it's got a really diverse group of plants associated with it that make their home there. And consequently, if it's got a diverse group of native plants, it's got a diverse group of insects as well. Those go hand in hand. So you can see Joe Pieweed and lake goldenrod and boneset and marsh fern and many other species occurring in these, and they're quite striking, quite beautiful. And this system occurs throughout the Midwest. As I said, it occurs in depressions on glacial outwash. It's supported by groundwater and surface water via streams, and soils are usually sapric peat. So in other words, they're organic soils where there's saturated conditions throughout the year, lacking anaerobic conditions, and we get this buildup of partially decomposed plant matter. And they're usually circumneutral or just slightly acidic to slightly alkaline, but usually they're right around circumneutral. That 6.7 to 7.3 pH is very frequent. Yeah, and you can see it occurring along the edges of lakes here. And so here's another diagram. We can see submergent marsh growing into emergent marsh, going into sedge meadow or wet prairie, very common. And then, if this was a beach ridge, this would be an interdunal wetland. If this was a sand beach, this little depression here would be considered interdunal wetland. If this was a dune, this little depression. And these variations, these zones can shift depending on changes in water levels. And so many systems, we see fluctuating water levels, wetter in the spring. Like this is a basin that may be wet in the spring and then dry down in the summer. And how do we know it's a wetland if we were not there when it's wet? You can tell by the vegetation, you can tell by the soils, but certainly in our interdunal wetlands, we'll see lots of rushes in those, and they're clearly wetlands. So the lake plain prairies and wet prairies. So we've classified the wet prairies into wet prairie and wet mesic prairie, and I'll mention what those are in a minute, but also lake plain prairie and lake plain wet mesic prairie. And that difference has to do with hydrology and the plant community, the wet versus wet mesic, and the difference between the lake plain and the other, without the lake plain wet prairie versus lake plain wet prairie, is the difference between systems that are influenced by changes in Great Lakes water levels that are on the lake plain, and systems that are inland from that. And I'll show you a map in a bit. So wet prairie is a lowland grassland community occurring throughout the Midwest, south of the tension zone, and occurs on soils that are slightly acid to moderately alkaline, sands, sandy loams, silt loams, silty clays, or high organics. And today this community is nearly extirpated from Michigan due to changes in land use and colonization by shrubs and trees. So consequently, they're both considered S1 critically imperiled. In other words, we've documented 5 or fewer high quality examples. It's got a diverse group of plants dominated by grasses, blue joint grass and cord grass, often with abundant sedges. So how does this community differ with its abundant sedges? How does it differ from sedge meadows? Sedge meadows are generally on organic soils, they're on peat, and prairies are on mineral soils. And they have wet prairies and lake plain wet prairies support a diverse group of wetland forbs. The wet mesic prairie and lake plain wet mesic prairie have a stronger prairie component. They're considered critically imperiled, both of them globally. That should be a G2, G1 I see, and a G1 globally, 1 critically imperiled and state imperiled. And they're imperiled likely, as I said earlier, probably because for several reasons. One is without fire, they'll succeed they'll grow lots of shrubs and trees quickly. So they'll quickly succeed to trees and shrub systems. So that's one of the reasons. 2 is they're good areas probably for agriculture because they can be drained, and it's got mineral soil that will support lots of plants for agriculture. So those are a couple factors, but it's a lowland grass community. It occurs in Midwest, Central US and Canada, and it's saturated conditions or seasonally inundated, and it can be found along the lake margins and isolated depressions, and on the lake plain. And it's primarily south of the tension zone, so south of that floristic tension zone. Soils are slightly acidic to moderately alkaline sands and sandy loams and silts, so a variety of mineral soils, but with high organic content. So it's you look at the soils, they're mineral, but they're black because of the high organic content. And like I said, this community is nearly extirpated, so rare. It's dominated by big bluestem and Indian grass with blue joint grass and cord grass and sedges, and supports a really diverse group of prairie plants. And it's quite striking. Okay, so in these communities, the lake plain versus the inland, the context is different, and also historically the size. The purple areas in the lake plain. So this is not a river, it's just a zone between the inner lobate region, the Jackson Inner Lobate Landscape Ecoregion that Denny Albert mapped, and the Maumee Lake Plain. Maumee was a glacial lake, so this is Lake Erie, and the lake was large enough to cover all the way up to almost Ann Arbor at one point, leaving a very level landscape with lots and lots of clay. And historically, there were large areas of wet prairie on that lake plain. Some of these were 20,000 acres, so they were huge, 10,000 acres, just massive. And in the inner lobate region, we tend to see it, like I said, on the edges of lakes, also within outwash channels along streams. So historically, you can see much smaller, a lot of it altogether, but they were smaller versus the lake plain prairies were historically quite large. So here's a lake plain prairie. That's Lake St. Clair you're looking at. This is St. John's Marsh. And so large, historically large areas, the natural disturbances, fluctuating water levels, fire, and flooding by beaver were all important. And as I said earlier, these systems were strongly influenced by changes in the Great Lakes water levels. Okay, so if we look at the St. Clair, to think about that Great Lakes marsh and the landscape complex and how wetlands occur. So here we're looking at Lake St. Clair, and with areas of Great Lakes marsh, and then on all these islands there were lake plain, these little islands, and here on the shoreline, lake plain prairies. So there was submergent marsh and emergent marsh and wet meadow, and then as we move up to away from a zone of constant flooding where the bacteria can break down those plants a little bit in the soil, and mineral soil can that wet mineral soil occurs. We have our wet prairies and our lake plain wet prairies, and this is a regionally important area for rare plants and rare animals and marsh birds. So we're lucky to have it. Canada is here, and the US is here. Okay, next group of communities I'll be talking about are the fens. And we've got a series of fens: prairie fens, northern fens, coastal fens, pattern fen, and poor fen. And fen in general is a non-forested mineral trophic, meaning groundwater fed. Mineral trophic, groundwater fed, wetland, where water is seeping out of the ground. So fens, we know, they're not contained in an isolated basin like many of our other wetlands, like our bogs, for example, but they are systems where water is leaving the system, and this is where our headwater streams occur. So this is a groundwater discharge system forming little headwater streams that then meet to form second order streams, and so on and so forth. So they're critically important. And you're looking at a prairie fen here in southern Michigan pictured. So they occur throughout the glaciated Midwest and Northeast, and soils are slightly alkaline, slightly acid to alkaline peat, depending on the type. And marl is common in some of the types. Marl is a calcium carbonate precipitate that forms this chalky substance that we see both in the soil column and at the surface in many systems. So the context, again, looking at a lot of our prairie fens in southern Michigan occur close to the bases of moraines, and the peat actually, it will form a hill. The peat will actually, the wet condition, the plant build up a plant matter over a year will form a hill, or they'll be right at the base, but on organic soil. That's critical for classification purposes. That same group of plants growing in a flatter landscape, and mineral soil could be classified as a wet prairie. So this is a peatland. Fens are peatlands, and water seeping out lower, just elevation wise. As you move down the slope, the water will be there for longer periods. It'll be above the surface, and you'll have a sedge meadow, typically a sedge meadow flooded for a portion of the year. Our fens are not systems that flood. You can rain and rain and rain and rain and rain, and the peat just absorbs it, and we get the sheet flow water running right off the surface, seeping out, running right across the surface of the fens. So as I mentioned, you can see them frequently occurring at the bases of moraines and around kettle lakes. And here's a picture of prairie fen. I was not tilting the camera. That is actually the slope. This is in Oakland County. That's Algo Lake, and there's a ice contact feature right here, gravelly cane, and with water seeping over this slope, coming right out of the slope and seeping down. So prairie fen is a wetland dominated by sedges, grasses, and other grass-like plants or graminoids that occurs where cold, calcareous groundwater fed springs reach the surface. Calcareous, I'll use this word, or calciphile, calcium loving. Calcareous means rich groundwater that's rich in calcium carbonate or magnesium carbonate, typically calcium carbonate, because the bedrock or the glacial till where the water is sitting in is full of limestone or pieces of limestone. And it's picking up the carbonates or calcium carbonates. And you get this alkaline condition for the plant, community. Natural processes that's from strongly structure composition, species composition, include groundwater seepage, lateral flow of water over the surface. That's seepage, not just runoff, but seepage. Fire, insect outbreaks, beaver flooding, and wind throw. So we see prairie fen commonly in the outwash channels, especially in southern Michigan, in this inner lobate. So here is our moraines, in that high elevation moraines, and at the base we find prairie fens, and in this outwash channel, it's common. And these are some of the major rivers also. And notice, I'll just point this out. I've always thought this is fascinating. This is what some people refer to as the Irish Hills, but this is the headwaters for a really important area for protection. At least the uplands too, as well as the wetlands, because this is supporting a lot of headwater streams, just in the side. Okay, prairie fen hydrology maintained by this cold seepage of mineral trophic groundwater. Soils are peat, as I've said before, and a marl as well. And you can see this is a headwater stream. There's a prairie right there, and there's a lake right behind me. So there's upland prairie right here. And so this stream comes right out to a couple hundred yards from where I took that picture. So it's got multiple vegetation zones and rich in floristic diversity, dominated by sedges and a variety of forbs and grasses. And here's what that marl zone looks like. The marl zones are typically associated with lakes. So I showed you the prairie, the context being sometimes they're associated with bases of moraines or in outwash channels with lakes. And here's a marl flat. You can see that white chalky calcium carbonate. And in those marl flats, it's a real distinctive plant community because the pH is about 8.0 or a little higher, which is about as high as we get, and which is as high as we get into the upper 7s, low 8s in Michigan for pH. And it's surprising. Most people think of pitcher plant and sundew as bog plants, and they certainly are bog plants, but they also eke out existence in these marl flats in prairie fens with lots of with high in all of our fens with where there's a very high pH. And prairie fen supports over 36 rare plants and animal species. So or 36 rare animals and 20 rare plant species. So, and that is the case. I highlighted here for this community, but each of these natural communities has a group of rare animals and rare plants. Each one of them does, that uses this habitat. And together, not every fen is going to have all of these species, and that's true for all the community types that have rare species. But I mentioned the importance of protecting them across their range, even within the state of Michigan, in the different ecoregions. Part of that is to protect the animals, because when you protect a community, you're protecting all the species associated with it. And if we can protect them across the range, like some here and some there and some there, then we're more likely to capture that variation in species diversity across that element, across that natural community. And with that, we'll capture some of the rare species, and we'll keep those from going extinct or becoming extirpated from the state. Okay. I thought I couldn't move forward there for a minute. I'm moving forward to northern fen. Okay, so just like prairie fen, northern fen is a wetland dominated by graminoids and sedges but this community occurs north of that floristic tension zone, where cold calcareous groundwater seepage still occurs, and soils are neutral to moderately alkaline peat and marl, and variations in flow rate and volume really influence what we see. Flow rate and volume of the groundwater really influence what we see. And so you're looking at a marl flat with stunted conifers, which is common. Conifers are stunted because of at these high alkalinities, or conversely at very low pH, very acidic. There isn't enough nutrients to support vast growth of species. So the conifers you'll see in those systems are often stunted. And here's another marl flat in a northern fen. And so northern fens are characterized by this calciphilic or calcium-loving flora dominated by graminoids, grass-like plants, as with a rich diversity of shrubs. You'll find these clumps of like islands, if you would, in the marl with stunted conifers. The red that you're seeing is pitcher plant. Along growing with that are sundews, very common. Another picture where you can see those low stunted conifers. Northern white cedar is most prevalent, but you also find sometimes black spruce, shrubby cinquefoil, and bog birch commonly in those systems as well. And sometimes these northern fens are dominated by wiregrass sedge or Carex lasiocarpa, which forms extensive mats. That's very common. I was just up in northern lower for vacation in northeast lower peninsula, and for fun, I'm surveying fens, doing it when I'm off, but it's just lots of fun. And they're beautiful. These extensive bedrock is very close to the surface here. So bedrock is outcropping, around Rogers City and Alpena and Thompson's Harbor. And you can see bedrock very close to the surface, and it's limestone, and it's full of calcium carbonate as shown here. So these carbonate rich aquifers, this limestone that's right here. So the soil is picking up all of these minerals, and or the water rather is picking all these minerals. The water table is close to the surface. Where the water table is close to the surface, it's seeping out and creating these conditions that are perfect for our fens. So that's where northern fens are there, and along the coast we'll have coastal fens. So this is Thompson's Harbor, which is a beautiful coastal fen, and where it's a Great Lakes Martian portion of it, but the back end, at the landward end, is a northern fen. Those are pitcher plants here. Pitcher plants, sundew, another rare plant called butterwort, stunted conifers, marl, cacalia, or what's now Arnoglossum plantaginea, the pale Indian plantain. So beautiful, beautiful system. It's dominated by sedges and rushes that occurs. So this coastal fen occurs in protective coves and abandoned coastal embayments so it's not directly impacted by huge waves from Lake Huron or Lake Michigan, and occurs along northern Lake Huron and northern Lake Michigan in the Upper Peninsula, but it's that eastern portion of the Upper Peninsula. Vegetation, like all of our fens, is comprised of calciphilic species, including twig rush, beak rush, Baltic rush, shrubby cinquefoil, and it's strongly influenced by Great Lakes water levels changes and groundwater seepage, as well as windthrow. Okay. Poor fen is a wetland dominated by sedges and moderately influenced by groundwater. Poor. So the term poor versus rich, when we use this in the context of natural communities or botanically, we're talking about poor in nutrients and sometimes plant species composition, but really what we're talking about, rich fen, rich in nutrients, poor fen, rich conifer swamp, rich in nutrients, poor conifer swamp, low in nutrients. So this is a poor fen. pH is more in the order of about 5.5 versus 7.5 or higher for our prairie fen and our northern fen. So it's a wetland dominated by sedges and moderately. Groundwater is still influenced by groundwater largely, but the groundwater is not as alkaline. This was in Keweenaw Bay on a Tombolo, where I took this as part of a Great Lakes marsh, and that's in the western UP. So we don't have that influence of that limestone here. So this wetland is a poor fen because of that lack of nutrients in the water that's coming up. And poor fen occurs primarily north of the tension zone. We found a few of them south, but primarily north of the tension zone. So the system is typically dominated by a continuous carpet of sphagnum moss with widely scattered raised peat mounds supporting low ericaceous shrubs and stunted conifers. Here's a different site in the Grayling Outwash Plain up near on Camp Grayling. It occurs in system can occur in porphyrin can occur in shallow depressions on sandy glacial outwash plains, or in kettle depressions on pitted outwash, and in depressions even on moraines. So the hydrology is supported by that weakly mineral trophic groundwater. Soils are very strongly acidic to strongly acidic, fibric peat again. And that shrub that you're looking at in the center, that's Chamaedaphne, that's leatherleaf. It's one of the species that dominates many bogs. So vegetation is comprised of species from northern fen and bogs. Dominant sedges include Carex oligosperma, and that's the sedge that really and wiregrass sedge, but Carex oligosperma tends to seem very, very dominant. Same as Lasiocarpa, but primarily oligosperma. The oligosperma is like an indicator species for this community. Lots of insectivorous plants, pitcher plant sundew, and a variety of sedges and other graminoids and bog plants. So that's sphagnum peat right here on that hummock there, growing with cranberries as well. So poor fen, constant natural disturbance, constant saturation, drought, fire, insect outbreaks, wind throw, flooding by beaver. And those were trees. This was on Camp Grayling. A fire had moved through here before I surveyed it, this right after, took this picture right afterwards. And you can see it's at Camp Grayling as a area with lots of pine barrens and military equipment. So fires occur and they spread across the wetland too. It's very common, these wetlands fires. People don't think about fire in wetlands, but it actually was very common historically, and in some places it still occurs. And it opens up the community. So it sets back succession, opens up, keeps it as an open system. Pattern fen is a rare wetland type, S2, a state imperiled, globally unranked. And this is, we have very few occurrences of this, but the occurrences that we do have are large. So it's normally found in vast lands. It's a vast system. And it's characterized by a series of peat ridges that are oriented parallel to the slope, but perpendicular to the flow of water. Just like when you watch water come up a beach and then go back down, it leaves these lines that are perpendicular to the flow of the lake. Like the lake comes up and goes back, and you end up with these lines here. And same thing with dunes, with wind moving across it. So that these ridges are peat ridges that run perpendicular to the flow of water. This community occurs on lake plains and outwash channels north of the detention zone, and in Michigan, primarily in the eastern UP. So the strings are raised peat ridges that are dominated by sedges, forbs, and low shrubs and stunted conifers. And the flarks are low swales, and they're seasonally inundated and dominated by sphagnum mosses, sedges, and rushes. So the hydrology is maintained by that constant groundwater seepage flowing through the system, right through the system. Snowmelt is doing the same thing, running across the system laterally, but it's running perpendicular to the, that groundwater is running perpendicular to the ridges. Soils are medium acid to circumneutral, so you'll get a combination of fen and bog plants, so very rich in plant diversity. Bog is not considered rare in Michigan, but that's because we have so many in northern Michigan. But southern Michigan, it is definitely rare. It's very hard to find a bog in southern Michigan, and the ones that we have are usually reduced. They're usually lower in diversity than the northern ones. In other words, not all the plants are able to tolerate the warmer conditions down here. So I would consider it rare in southern Michigan, but statewide it's apparently secure because our ranking is at a state level. And bog is an acidic peatland dominated by sphagnum mosses and ericaceous shrubs that occurs across the northern hemisphere. You're looking at the white flowers there are cotton grass, and it occurs in kettle depressions on pitted outwash, where we have lots of those ice block depressions, as well as depressions in moraines and in depressions on glacial outwash and glacial lake plains. Hydrology So this is rather than mineral trophic, mineral fed, this is ambrotrophic, rainwater fed. So this is primarily fed through precipitation. All of our wetlands, just about all the wetlands, are in contact with groundwater that are seeping up. But in bogs, there has been enough buildup of peat to separate that upper layer of peat from the lower level. So they're strongly influenced by the development of sphagnum moss mats, which sphagnum moss in a wetland creates acidic conditions. It pumps out hydrogen ions, so it creates acidic conditions. And so that combination of dominated by sphagnum moss and then such deep buildup of peat creates these acidic soils. So soils are extremely acidic and fibric peat. So when you pull up a sample here, I'm pulling up a sample, a core sample, and that soil probe, I carry that with me everywhere. So looking at soils is fascinating. And you can see all kinds of plant material. You can find little conifer seeds and cones and woody peat as well. So when you're looking at bogs, you're looking at that fibric peat, where it's often wood fragments are often part of it, meaning that it was part of a conifer swamp at some point in its past as well. So natural insect outbreaks are a natural disturbance, as well as flooding by beaver, wind throw, and occasional fires. It's got a vast diversity of species associated with it, and those red color up in front, you're seeing pitcher plants. Okay, so here's a basin, and this is an ice block illustration of an ice block depression with an open system as bog. And if it was a bog, but it was dominated by conifers, black spruce and tamarack, and sometimes jack pine, we would refer to that as a poor conifer swamp. So a forested bog versus a non-forested bog, essentially. Okay, muskeg is a rare community in Michigan, and it's a large acidic peatland with scattered or clumped stunted conifers and a matrix of sphagnum moss and ericaceous shrubs that occurs across the northern hemisphere. So this is again one of these big systems like pattern peatland. It doesn't have the patterning, but it's not a system we map within a small little area. It's typically on glacial lake plains or large outwash plains, and it's characterized by black spruce and tamarack and Carex oligosperma, which is that poor fen sedge that I mentioned earlier, as well as bog plants like leatherleaf and cranberries and blueberries. So you can see those stunted conifers set in that matrix of Carex oligosperma and other sedges with a carpet of sphagnum moss and these low peat mounds. But that structure is that muskeg. And so these are ambrotrophic again. They're primarily fed by precipitation. Yes, there's groundwater somewhere down in that system, but peat has accumulated above that zone of influence. So it's an acidic system with extremely acidic, with a pH of 4.0 to 4.5 sapric peat, primarily from sphagnum moss and occasional wood fragments. And the natural processes, fire, in, I think it might have been 2007, I might have the year wrong, but it was about that time. The Sleeper Lake fire burned through a big muskeg complex in the eastern UP. Wind throw, beaver flooding, and insect outbreaks are all important disturbances. Okay. Intermittent wetland is a rare wetland type that is found in a similar context as the bogs on the Kettle Depression. So there's small depressions that will often support a small lake as part of it. And I refer to these colloquially as drawdown lakes. And you all know these systems because you drive by what looks like a small lake, and one year it's supporting water, and some years later you look and it's just completely dried up, and you're like, what's going on? And so those water levels can fluctuate, and that's where we see our intermittent wetland. And you can see this in the ringed vegetation. So this ringed vegetation. Now this system is very similar to, in the same kind of context as, and operations of this fluctuating water level as from seasonally and fluctuating in the spring and in summer. You know, it's wet in the spring, drier later on, but also from year to year changes. And you can see this in coastal plain marsh as well. They're very similar in terms of the dynamics, the natural processes, different plant communities, but natural processes. So vegetation includes sedges and rushes and mosses and ericaceous shrubs such as leatherleaf. And that's what you're seeing here and here. So they occur along the shores of lake shores, and they're characterized by fluctuating water levels and that, again, seasonally and year-to-year fluctuations. Soils are acidic sands and or sandy peat. So peat with lots of sand mixed in it. And they're also, we'll find them as a bog vegetation. So they're a mix of bog and marsh vegetation. And you'll see this. So this is leatherleaf. And if you know, the left half of the screen, I would say bog, and the right half of the screen, intermittent wetland. But this is one basin. This is one basin. And likely, we don't know for sure, but likely these could have formed when a beaver pond failed that was supporting a lake at that area and bog going up to it, or it could be fire. So fire burning through a shallow bog, a shallower bog, burning through a shallow bog, because these lakes are shallow. The lake you're looking at is very shallow. Some years you can walk across it. So it's a system where possibly maybe the peat mat was thin enough that fire moving, these are embedded in conifer systems, upland conifers, fire could move through it and burn the peat mat. So we're not quite sure, but it's possibly they're burned out bog in some locations. So coastal plain marsh, I think that I put that slide in the wrong spot. So I might be able to come back to it. Oh gosh, I got this backwards. Sorry guys, but I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna go backwards through this for this one, I think. So coastal plain marsh is an imperiled, so it's S2 and it's G2, meaning globally, there's very few occurrences of this system. And in Michigan, certainly global. So coastal plain marsh is a graminoid and forb-dominated wetland that contains numerous plant species disjunct from their primary ranges in the Atlantic and Gulf coastal plain. It occurs in depressions on sand deposits associated with post-glacial lakes and in outwash channels primarily in the western lower peninsula. Fluctuating water levels, both seasonally and year to year, greatly influence species composition. So bear with me. I'm going to see if I can go down to the next. Okay, good. So far, so good. So in some years, you'll see it flooded with water. Other years or during season, it will be, I don't want to say dry because you can see that that's wet there, but it's very open, no water. And in another year, it can look like a pond. It's amazing. It'll look like a lake. And you the type of thing you would never just walk across it because you wouldn't know how deep it was. It looks like a lake. But if you visit that same site many years in a row, eventually you'll see this flooding occur and this drawdown occur. These drawdown, like you could think about it like a drawdown lakes. But this community supports, how does it differ from intermittent wetland? It supports species that are disjunct from the Atlantic and Gulf coastal plains. So it's quite different. Many of these are rare species. In fact, rare species of plants. In fact, it supports over 40 rare species are known to occur in coastal plain marsh. So in addition to the rare species, it also hosts a broad diversity of other species, but they are, there's a group of plants that you just don't see very often. If those of you that are botanists know this system, and those of you who are not, but maybe casual botanists, you'll see genera like Bulbostylus and Aristida and Fimbrostylus and Rhynchospora and Eriocolon and Lipocarpa. Like you just don't see these plants. So this is a community that's really distinctive, a group of plants. Some are state listed. And some are not, but it's a really distinct group of plants. Another one of our very rare communities is inland salt marsh. and S1. There's only been one known site, and it's in Maple River State Game Area. It's so it's critically, it's G1, it should be G1, S1, sorry. And it's inland salt marsh, I think it's G1, is a salt marsh that is an herbaceous wetland on mineral soil saturated with sodium and chlorine laden groundwater from natural brine aquifers. It's characterized by Olney's rush and dwarf spike rush and spear scale. So it's a unique system. Its open conditions are maintained by groundwater seepage of Silurian aged marine rocks. So lots of halides in those. And it's been historically, the system, it was always been very rare in Michigan, but the other known systems were exploited for salt production. And so there's only one site remaining today. Interdunal wetland is a system, I mentioned this earlier. So in our dunes along along the shoreline of Lake Michigan and northern Lake Huron and Lake Superior and northern Lake Michigan in the eastern UP, we have beautiful dunes, beautiful, incredible dunes. And often behind the foredune, you'll find a swale, or and that swale is got fluctuating water levels with changes in the Great Lakes, but water will come up and you'll have a unique group of plants in that system. They're striking. I was just over at PJ Hoffmaster 2 weekends ago, hiking there, and in Muskegon State Park, especially. I think it was, I'm sorry, Muskegon. I was in both, but Muskegon State Park has some nice interdunal wetlands in that state park. So interdunal wetlands is dominated by rushes, sedges, and shrubs. Occurs in depressions within open dunes, along the ridges, and between the ridges of dunes on the Great Lake shoreline. Soils are circumneutral to moderately alkaline sands. So the dune sands are generally alkaline sands. So those soils there are circumneutral to moderately alkaline as well. So you get a group of calciphiles moving into that system. So it's a fen vegetation often, and water levels fluctuate both seasonally and from year to year, and strong species. That fluctuation really structures the species composition. So a diverse group of plants. Here's another photo in between beach ridges. And then I think this might be the last community I'll talk about, is also critically imperiled. Very few elements, we've documented this only in couple spots. And this is a mesic sand prairie that is a native lowland grass that occurs in shallow depressions on sandy outwash plains and sandy lake plains in the northern, in the lower peninsula, primarily in northern lower peninsula. So it's dominated by prairie and wetland grasses and sedges, big blue stem, little blue stem, tussock sedge. So it's got that full complement of prairie species, but in a matrix of sand and fluctuating water levels. So this is a system that can be wet in the spring of the year or from year to year, and just the water levels will later on in some years will drop down quite a bit. So it supports both upland and wetland species. Soils are loamy sands or fine sands, usually with a high organic content and sometimes covered by a thin layer of muck. And natural disturbances include water level fluctuations, flooding by beaver, and fire. So I'm happy to take a couple questions, and then we'll take a break and we'll come back at 11.
That sounds great, Mike. And what a fun journey to take a trip through all of these beautiful wetlands over the last hour, and just the photos are amazing. Couple different questions. One is, so Dave just asked, he's got your book. He says great resource, so thank you. And then he wonders about whether or not these state rankings are still accurate, and how often should they be reviewed to ensure we keep up with their expansion, contraction, gains, and losses.
They're reviewed pretty frequently. So
Great.
The ecologists at Michigan Natural Features Inventory are continuing to conduct inventory. And where I think the difficulty comes in, to be honest with you, this is, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, is that, and it's a funding issue. So
Right.
States do that differently. So each state has a heritage program, but they're not all the same. And our state is funded primarily, it's all soft money, it's all grants. And the DNR supports MNFI with an allocation of resources every year that covers a 60 to 80, 65, 70% of their budget. But it's to work on, to do conservation work, important conservation work on primarily state lands. The other part of the budget comes from a variety of funders, from local to federal. And but what that means is there's a gap to survey the private lands.
Mm-hmm.
And we have some significant private land holdings. So so there's a gap. There's a gap there. So the whole state. So Minnesota is doing theirs county by county by county. They're doing all the lands county by county by county. And we're doing our inventory based on where there's available dollars to send a field crew in to do the inventory. And that's the gap. So yeah, I think some of the ranks can be updated, but the problem is lack of information that we feel confident in, because what we're trying to assess is we can sometimes see on your photos, oh yeah, that system's there, or you drive by and you're like, oh yeah, that system's there, but you haven't been in it. And you really can't say about the quality, because we're ranking on size, landscape, context, and condition. And condition is really important, because when you're talking about high quality, we want to be ranking based on what we know is in good condition, not because that affects viability. What we're talking about is this element viable. It's a triage approach. Conservation in the heritage scale is a triage approach. You're putting the effort toward the rarest of the rare. You're putting when you have dollars to do so, and you're putting effort toward inventorying. You're looking for high quality examples. You're not just like documenting everything. You're not doing land cover mapping. You're not saying, okay, this is here, this is it, this is here next. You're doing assessments based on viability for conservation purposes. It was really a scale. The classification is built to help figure out what lands do we need to protect, so to protect biodiversity across the state. And how do we describe that? How do we describe this repeating pattern of ecosystems, this repeating pattern? What is that repeating pattern? And then how do we make sure that we've captured things, right? So it's an approach to conservation like a big ship, right? If we capture this community, we capture everything with it. So
that's great. Thanks for that, Mike. Good to know. And then Bob asks, he says you've been talking about water levels. He said, I'd be curious to hear your opinion about how the recent high water period in Lake St. Clair has impacted the wet prairies and the flats.
Well, I haven't seen it, so I would like to see it. But what we see in Phragmites is, when I go to that area, Phragmites, it's just taken over lots of the wet prairies, and so I would think that if it could impact, hybrid cattail and Phragmites are the plagues to lots of our herbaceous wetlands. They're even the sedge meadows in the interlobate region. They're just like marching right through. Even bogs, Mud Lake Bog in Washtenaw County is being taken over by believe it or not, by hybrid cattail. It's just marching across the bog. So I think if how do these water levels change it? If they make it so that those species, the invasives, are able to spread further, it's not good. And if they reduce that's fine. That would be, so that it really kind of boils down to that. I think the system, the roots, Denny Albert's done a lot of work looking at Scenoplectus, the bulrushes, and its ability to, in the Great Lakes marshes, exist underwater for many years. And then when water levels drop to the right level, it can come up again. So it's really amazing that these species can stay at the root level for a long time. So I'm not concerned at all about the flooding for a few years on the prairies. I don't know for sure, but I think that's probably okay. It's a matter of what it does to the balance, that competitive balance of the invasive species.
Yep. Okay, let's ask one more question before we take a break. And that is a question from Kenny. How big does a muskeg need to be considered a muskeg?
Oh gosh, I don't have that number off the top of my head.
Okay.
I don't have that number off the top of my head, but you're looking at a structural thing. There's a look to those. And when you're in them, you see like they have this different look, like that sphagnum carpet with these scattered savanna, this really savanna structure is a muskeg. And but generally we don't find that system develop into that kind of scattered look until it gets larger. It's kind of like saying, if you go into a park that the size of a football field, is it a savanna? Well, it's got one tree in it. I don't know. But, if it's 500 acres, now you see, you can really see it's a savanna. So it's also a scale issue, but I think it's a scale issue for the community too. I don't think we get that development of that structure until we have and that widely scattered thing, until we get it big enough to look at it. So I don't have that number, but it's probably more in the hundreds.
Yeah. Okay, great. So one other thing that I'm going to ask you later, not now, but as we were talking about this, I asked folks to share favorite memories or favorite experiences in wetlands. And Janice shared, I love how you can be walking on solid land and then all of a sudden you're up to your waist.
Yeah.
Right? It's just that shocking thing. There was a time when I was out fishing with my son and nephew, and they were little. They were maybe 11 and 8 or something. And we were walking along and he was up to his neck. It was definitely, I was glad we had life preservers on, but yeah. So I want to ask you what it's like for you in walking across these different systems, and to share some of your stories of walking across these.
It's just a joy.
Right?
I feel like I'm seeing all my old friends, so I just am like a little kid in a candy shop when I'm in these wetlands. Yeah, I mean, I don't like going over often in muck boots, or if every day when I get to the wetland, I have to make a decision, what shoes am I going to wear? Am I going to go over the top of my muck boots or not? So I put in, I'm just going to be wet today. But no, it's like a kid in a candy shop seeing all my old friends. It's just so fun. And like I said, looking at the soils, it's like, oh, wow, oh my gosh, look at, and so the plants and it's beautiful. Just good to be outdoors too. I think we all love that.
Absolutely. Okay, so Mike, how long of a break do you want to take right now?
Just give me a couple of minutes. 5 minutes. Is that good?
Minutes. We're going to come back at 2 after.
2 minutes after. Okay. See you then. Okay.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thanks all. And then go ahead and drop in the chat your favorite experiences. I think there's a time when I was walking along and found this just bird's nest with a hummingbird nest in it. And so drop in the chat and get up and stretch around, and we'll be back.
All right.
Ready to roll.
Okay, we're going to be talking about forested wetlands in this next hour. And I'm happy to take questions afterwards, or if it will really help clarify during the talk. So the natural communities, the wetlands are here. The purple are considered rare wetlands based on their rank of being G1, G2, or G3, S1, S2, S3. And this information is available in a variety of resources. We'll talk about that right at the end. We'll show you some of those, and including websites. So that's nice, this information. And when we talk about rare, we're looking at ranks that are classified based on the number of high quality occurrences. And so for forested wetlands, we'll start with poor conifer swamp, which is not considered a rare system because it's essentially a forested bog, and we know in northern Michigan there's lots of bogs. So, but nonetheless, it's a wetland that's an important wetland. And so this is an acidic peatland characterized by the prevalence of conifer trees and ericaceous shrubs and sphagnum mosses. It's spire shaped. You can see those are black spruce, and that very spire shape to it. And it's got an herbaceous layer with a hummocky carpet of sphagnum moss. Dominant trees are black spruce and tamarack typically, and occasionally jack pine. And so it occurs throughout the Midwest and Northeast on sandy glacial lake plains, outwash plains, pitted outwash, ice contact topography, and moraines. And its hydrology. So it's It's a ambrotrophic system again, so it's an acidic system considered rainwater fed. Certainly there's groundwater at the base, somewhere in that wetland complex that's supporting the wet conditions, but the peat is accumulated above the zone of groundwater influence, and it's extremely acidic, fibric peat. So it's got a bog vegetation, a group of species we think of as bog species, like the ericaceous shrubs like leatherleaf and wintergreen and sheep laurel and blueberries and cranberries and a variety of sedges that are adapted to those acidic conditions as well. And as I showed you earlier, in the Kettle Depression that supports bog as an open system, and when the conifers reach essentially a closed canopy, and they are comprised of black spruce and tamarack and sometimes jack pine, that would be considered a poor conifer swamp, and poor meaning poor in nutrients. So its natural disturbances would be wind throw, flooding, insect outbreaks, and fire. So rich conifer swamp is considered a rare community, and another name for rich conifer swamp is cedar swamp. This is a groundwater fed conifer swamp dominated by northern white cedar, or some people call it arborvitae, Thuja occidentalis, arborvitae or northern white cedar. And it occurs primarily north of the tension zone. We've seen it a few times, we find it a few times in southern Michigan, very rarely. And so it occurs in depressions on glacial lake plains, outwash plains, and outwash channels and moraines. Here you see a rich conifer swamp, and rich meaning rich in nutrients, because it's a groundwater fed, it's a mineral trophic system. And with these moraines seeping, lots of seeps in this outwash channel here between the moraines. And it's also common where calcareous bedrock, where limestone and dolomite underlay a thin mantle of glacial drift, meaning a little bit of glacial material on a lake plain, where calcareous groundwater seeps occur at the base, and where calcareous groundwater seeps occur at the base of moraines. So I mentioned I was just up in northeastern Lower Peninsula, where there's limestone right at the surface, and lots of cedar swamp in that area, and along with that corollary is northern fen, both mineral trophic systems. So soils are sometimes strongly acid where you have lots of sphagnum, but they can be also mildly peat. So this is in contact with that groundwater. So I'm sorry, mildly alkaline, saturated. And the soils are saturated coarse woody peat. So, and like I said, where a blanket of sphagnum moss covers the soil, then you'll have acidic conditions. But where it's absent, you'll have circumneutral to mildly alkaline peat. And that will influence who grows there. That'll influence the plant community quite a bit. And these are cedars, by the way, for those of you not familiar with these. So these are northern white cedars, at least the bases of them, not that we are looking at. And the hydrology is mineral trophic, fed by groundwater, rich in calcium carbonate and magnesium carbonate. And so streams, these will be along you'll see these along headwater streams and second order streams, high order streams. Vegetation is dominated by northern white cedar, sphagnum mosses sometimes blanket the ground layer, and then rich group of plants from sedges to ferns, goldthread, bunchberry, creeping snowberry, twin flower, Canada mayflower, so naked mitrewort. So you'll have this really incredible group of plants. And natural disturbances include wind throw, seasonal water level fluctuations, insect outbreaks, flooding by beaver, and fire. So cedar, when it falls over, its lower branches, if they make good contact with the ground and that moist organic soil, they can take root and trees can grow up. So large blowdowns in cedar swamps can result in regeneration of cedar as well. So cedar can regenerate through seedlings as well as through tip-ups. Rich tamarack swamp is primarily a southern system, and it is groundwater influenced it's a groundwater influenced forested wetland dominated by tamarack, and occurs both north and south of the detention zone, but it's associated with our prairie fens here in southern Michigan in our inner lobate region. Rich tamarack swamp typically occurs in areas of groundwater seepage associated with headwater streams and lakes. It occurs in outwash channels and outwash plains and kettle depressions where the glacial till is high in calcium and magnesium carbonates, especially common in the glacial interlobate region of southern Michigan. And the hydrology is minerotrophic, in other words, fed by groundwater rich in calcium carbonate. Soils are neutral to moderately alkaline, woody peat with layers of sedge peat, and the soils are often underlain by marl. So I had a soil core for one summer that it went down 13 feet and looked at a number of these rich tamarack swamps. And all of them, there was, right at the base was a marl layer, which meant that it probably formed many years ago on a lake bed where there was chara or another species that exudes, that precipitates out marl, this white chalky substance. And so its history probably started as a fen, but over 10,000 years it developed. It went through several stages, and you can see these different stages in the peat core, going from from fen to sedge meadow to conifer swamp and back and forth. All right, rich tamarack swamp vegetation, sorry. Overstories dominated by tamarack, often along with black ash, yellow birch, American elm, red maple, swamp white oak, and sometimes even northern white cedar. And that's tamarack in the fall, around the end of October, first week in November, turns this beautiful golden color. And that's poison sumac, also turns a beautiful color. So rich tamarack swamp supports a very diverse group of shrubs, from tall shrubs to low shrubs. I think during that, I did a lot of vegetation sampling in this system, detailed vegetation sampling over a couple summers, and recorded 28 different shrubs that occur in southern Michigan's rich conifer swamp, rich tamarack swamps. And this essentially is the corollary. So I talked about cedar swamp being a northern system primarily. We've only found it a couple times in southern Michigan, but that same conditions exist, just like our prairie fens and our northern fens are the same conditions that create those occur also within our forested wetlands. And in southern Michigan, tamarack kind of fills that gap of cedar. So where we have this groundwater discharge wetlands that move toward forest in southern Michigan, that's typically dominated by tamarack, and then in northern Michigan by northern white cedar. But there's a big difference between them, because tamarack they're both need light, they're both light dependent, but cedar has this added advantage of being able to regenerate when it falls over. And in tamarack it's for all practical purposes an early successional species, because it generally doesn't regenerate in shade. So it needs some type of disturbance to keep it open. Yeah, I mean, to keep it regenerating when the trees die. So it supports a diverse calciphilic flora and a variety of sedges, grasses, ferns, and forbs. And here you're looking at a prairie fen, but over time, this will succeed to rich tamarack swamp, and that's the origin. A lot of them, they move from fen to rich tamarack swamp, and then an insect outbreak occurs, and it goes back to fen, or a fire occurs and kills the tamarack, or sets back the tamarack and moves to fen. Beaver comes in, flood the system, the dam is broken, moves out, and it starts as fen and moving toward rich tamarack swamp. So there's this cycle. Important natural disturbances: insect outbreak and fire, seasonal water level fluctuation, flooding by beaver, and wind throw. Okay, hardwood conifer swamp is considered vulnerable in the state, S3, a rare system, and it is a groundwater influenced forested wetland dominated by a mixture of lowland hardwoods and conifers. The community occurs on peat and poorly drained mineral soils and a variety of landforms throughout Michigan. And vegetation is typically dominated by a mix of hardwood and conifer. hardwoods would be red maple and yellow birch, and conifers, white pine, northern white cedar, and hemlock. So, and I would say in some parts of the state, primarily hemlock. So we see hemlock in our uplands, in our sugar maple forests, in the Upper Peninsula and Northern Lower as well. But in a wetland context, here, mixed with yellow birch and and red maple, we see it in a wetland context. So it's often associated with headwater streams in areas of groundwater seepage, wind throw, fluctuating water levels, and beaver flooding are all important natural disturbances. Okay, floodplain forest, also S3 vulnerable, is a bottomland deciduous forest, and it can be dominated. It's primarily hardwood in southern Michigan, but in northern Michigan, it can be hardwood or deciduous conifer, so it could be a mix, occupying low areas adjacent to streams and rivers that are third order or greater. So all of the other forested wetlands that I've showed you so far, well, I should say, rich conifer swamp and northern hardwood swamp are in the upper reaches, are generally in the upper reaches of streams. And floodplain forest is in the lower reaches where the rivers become larger. And it's subject to periodic over the bank flooding and cycles of erosion, and species composition and community structure. They vary by the flooding frequency and duration and where it is in the floodplain itself. So dominants include sugar maple, sycamore, basswood, green ash, or formerly green ash, and elm. And so third order, what do we mean? So stream order. So so here in the upper streams, upper here, we'd have prairie fens and rich tamarack swamps, and we'd have northern fens, and we would have rich conifer swamps. And then as we move down here, the hardwoods along the floodplains, along the rivers anyway, we end up with, generally we end up with hardwoods. That's not true always in the northern lower. You'll have hemlock and cedar associated with those systems too. But in southern Michigan, we find our tamarack swamps and our fens in the upper orders, high order, what we call high orders, and then lower order. So I know it's kind of opposite. It's third order or greater, meaning two second order tributaries have come together to form a third order stream. So in Michigan, floodplain forests are generally most developed or most extensive in the southern lower peninsula and on level landforms such as lake plains and outwash plains. And I'll say especially the lake plains, where lots of water is coming to the system and it slows down and gets real wide, moving through these systems. So they're very well developed on the lake plains especially. Hydrology is surface water from tributaries and overland flow, but also surprisingly mineral trophic groundwater seepage. So many of these systems, they're in outwash channels, often at the base of hills, almost always, or often at the base of hills. And so they're the lowest system, and you'll have groundwater discharge feeding them as well. Soils are generally circumneutral to mildly alkaline, sandy loams, silt loams, clays, because it's got it's flooding, and whatever the river is carrying and depositing over eons is what's making up the soil. You also have organics sometimes further from the river channel, like in old abandoned oxbows. So the soils vary by glacial landform, but also what it's cutting through, but also by the fluvial landform of the system itself. So the frequency, it varies by frequency of overbank flooding, distance from the river channel, and groundwater discharge. So here's a diagram of a floodplain, and you can see these. This is an old, so the river channel once went through here. So in other words, it was once going like this, and then a big flood happened, lots of water, and it just cut through, it cut off, and now it's here. So this is an old abandoned oxbow, and in that old abandoned oxbow, you can have very different vegetation growing than you'll have on this levee. Along the edge of the stream, you'll have this levee right here, And that'll be often very sandy. And so you'll have different species growing here than in the back swamps, further from the, these back swamps further from the river channel. So it tends to be a really diverse system. And if I did a project for a couple of years looking at these floodplain forests and documented lots of rare plants, rare animals in them. So the trees, often maples and silver maple especially, green ash historically, sycamore, cottonwoods. Cottonwoods will be on those sandy levees close to the river, typically. Bur oak and in northern Michigan, in northwest Michigan, you'll have cedar and hemlock as well. So a diverse group of sedges and forbs and ferns. Natural disturbances include flooding, ice scour, and beaver. And so beaver are using these rivers for movement. And even in southern Michigan, we see trees along rivers that are chewed by beaver. And they're nesting in the bank sometimes as well. A similar system, but in a different landscape context, is southern hardwood system, S3 vulnerable. I mentioned that hardwoods they've become more prevalent in northern Michigan. But in southern Michigan, I'm actually a little concerned about this community type because I don't see good examples of it. I think what's happening to all of our forests, we just keep cutting down our forests and cutting down our forests as we develop, and that's upland forest, and I think that happens to the lowland forest. So I don't think this is when somebody asked a question about inventory, and I have a sense that we may. I don't know how many high quality examples we have remaining of this. That's an unknown. Maybe we have plenty, but I'm not so sure of that. So it's a system that's groundwater influenced, and it's a mix of lowland hardwoods, and occurs throughout the glaciated Midwest and Northeast. And it occupies shallow depressions on high order streams and drainages, and a variety of landforms. It occurs on lake plains, outwash channels, and in depressions on moraines. It's supported by mineral trophic groundwater seepage and surface water from overflow. And soils are typically about circumneutral to mildly alkaline, sandy loams, silt loams, clay loams, and often underlain by a clay layer. It's occasionally found on sapric peats in association with mineral trophic or hardwood conifer swamps, mineral trophic conifer or conifer swamps. So hardwood conifer swamps. And one of the change I've seen is that the rich tamarack swamps, when red maple comes into them, it will, and silver maple too, they will eventually succeed and overtop the tamarack and change that system to hardwood. I've seen that a number of times in the interlobate system. So, and you can tell it's an old conifer swamp by the rest of the vegetation, because it looks, you can read the other plants and you can see, and then you can see you can still see dead standing tamarack within the hardwood swamp. So I think the system is worth more study. Species composition varies by soil type, hydrology, and regional floristic patterns. Sites on mineral soil that experience seasonal water level fluctuations are typically dominated by silver maple and historically green ash and American elm, and often red maple and occasionally pin oak are associates. And on organic soil with more stable hydrology, and that's the case on these organic soils because the organic soils are not flash, they can absorb the water, so we don't see the big changes in water levels with the organic soils because they're able to absorb the water that we do in mineral soil. So but you'll see it growing with yellow birch and black ash historically, and American elm. Vegetation is a diverse group of flora, from sedges to forbs to a variety of ferns as well. And hard disturbances include seasonal water level fluctuations, flooding, drought, invasive species, emerald ash borer and Dutch elm disease, windthroat, and beaver flooding. So think this might be the last system that I had queued up. Is Wet Music Flatwoods. And Wet Music Flatwoods is a state imperiled S2 system. And it's wet to wet music conditions on mineral soil dominated by a diverse mixture of upland and lowland hardwoods. Occurs almost exclusively on poorly drained glacial lake plains in southeastern lower peninsula. Soils are medium to slightly acid, sandy loams to loams, and overlaid by mildly to moderately alkaline sandy clay loams, clay loam or clay, and often underlain by an impermeable clay layer. So clay so it may look sandy soil at top, but within close to the surface is this clay layer that's impeding moisture drainage rather. Vegetation it's got a diverse tree canopy. Dominants include oaks, hickories, and basswoods. So it has a resemblance of an upland system, lots of vernal pools, but the soils tell a different story. And Shumard oak is a rare species that also is common or can occur in the system. Dominant trees often dominated by red oak, with white oak, swamp white oak, bur oak, shagbark hickory, shellbark hickory, American beech, sugar maple, silver maple, red maple, and basswood. It is strongly influenced by seasonal inundation, wind throw, and occasional fires. So Wet Music Flatwoods historically probably occupied, and I say probably, so historically we know that mixed hardwood swamps. MNFI did a circa 1800 vegetation map in which the college has sat for many winters, or for over a number of winters, in the State Historical Library, reading the notes from the surveyors in the 1800s and then transcribing them onto maps to document and writing detailed notes about what species were found where at every mile marker, at every corner and half mile. They recorded the distance to the trees, the size of the trees, and the species of trees, and a variety of other information. So they put together, based on their knowledge of the state and the geology and the soils and the information from the surveyors, they put together this map of circa 1800 vegetation. So and mapped it based on where the surveyor was crossing wetlands. So for example, wetlands, the surveyor said entering this system, leaving the system, entering this vegetation type, leaving the system, and they measured the distance across the streams and so on and so forth. And so they put that information on visually on maps so they could begin to get a sense for it using topographic maps to map it out. And that's how this map was made. So it's a good map at a kind of a coarse scale to get a sense for a region or an area. And mixed hardwood swamp was recorded. They've documented this rich hardwood swamp in those areas of brown. And you can see those areas are huge. Some of them are 40 to 60,000 acres of mixed hardwood swamp. And those are on mineral soil in the Maumee Lake Plain. So it occurs in association with these wet prairies, these lake plain wet prairies, and probably also wet meadows and lake plain oak openings, these oak savannas, these lake plain oak openings, and then mesic forest here. So this sugar maple beech forest. What we would need to do is really go into those notes and look more closely, but I suspect that some of the mixed hardwood swamp, or if not a lot of it, was this Wet Music Flatwoods, and that this system was probably more wide, was occupying many of these mixed hardwood swamps, and maybe even into the beech maple, sugar maple beech forest. So it'd be interesting. It's another analysis that would need to be done and looked at, but there were these huge hardwood swamps that in Monroe and Wayne County and along that Clay Lake Plain historically. Okay, so I want to thank my former colleagues at MNFI for helping collect and analyze and write up all this great information. And then I want to thank the Stewardship Network and the DEQ as well, and the Nature Conservancy in Heron Clinton Park providing funding to do that work. And thank you all for showing up and for EGLE and the Stewardship Network and for supporting this event. So I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, Mike, thanks. Those forested wetland communities are so beautiful. As Aline was sharing her memory of wetland communities have been humbling to me, both in terms of their beauty and their intricacy, and also due to the unique circumstances they offer us, like being up to my knees in muck with poison sumac on all sides.
Yeah.
And then I was one of the memories that I have. My parents lived on the Ohio River on a boat for 12 years, and I grew up in Cincinnati, and the river floods every spring, and just kayaking through the floodplain forest in the spring with just so magical, right? With the light green, buds just emerging. And so questions are, do you have tips for differentiating an upland hemlock forest from a hemlock swamp?
Well, so I mentioned right off the bat, so you've got these 3 factors, right? You've got this, and I want to show you some resources. I just remember that was my next slide after that. So I'm going to go to some of the resources. So the vegetation should really help you out, because if you could take a species list, each of those plants is an indicator of wetland and has a number, and those numbers can be summed up, and you can take an average and you can see is it dominated by wetland plants. You can look at the soils and is it peat or is it mineral soil? And if it's mineral soil, does it have this leached out layer? Now, if it has a hemlock, I mentioned earlier that there's a soil type called spotted soils, where you have this leached out gray horizon that looks like that glade layer. It's usually in sand though. And all the indicators, all the plants are upland plants. So it's not, you typically don't confuse that. But just because you see a gray soil horizon does not mean a wetland. But with wetland plants, a gray soil horizon is a good indicator of a wetland, those 2 things together. And then hydrology, is it wet in the spring? Is it at least wet in the spring? Do you need your muck boots, or are your tennis shoes going to get a little damp? It doesn't have to be over the top, but generally you can see the hydrology. So hydrology, soils, and vegetation, those 3 things come together. So
that's
okay.
great.
All right.
Yeah, as you go to research.
Yeah, let me go to resources. I'm going to share my screen again.
Yeah, because I think, and then I also want to just let people know who may not be paying attention to the chat that there have been some questions about, will the recording be available? And yes, it will. It'll be on both our YouTube channel as well as on our stewardshipnetwork.org/EGLE website that Rob has we've dropped in the chat a few times. And then, Mike, as you're pulling up what I'm sure are going to be great resources, a couple different questions about what's your favorite wetland type and why? Oh
gosh, that's like asking me what my favorite child is.
I know, right? Exactly.
So I don't know. That's a really hard one. I love the fens, to be honest. I love the fens, but I also love those northern acidic systems too. So it's hard to know. I mean, they're just and coastal plain marshes are great. They're just frustrating because there's all these species you never see. Yeah. Like, what are you?
You know they're there, right?
Yeah. So that's So okay, where was I? I was going to, let me just bring that. I just was there, and so let me just bring that up and share my screen.
Great.
Okay, I think that I have to share just making sure that. I want to make sure that
are you at MNFI?
Yeah. But I'm also going to share. Okay, I think I can do it this way. Okay, I'm going to share that. Okay, so you should be seeing, are you seeing my whole screen, or are you just seeing the MNFI portion?
We're seeing your whole screen. If you maximize your
browser. Okay.
There you go. Now, yep, right. That's great.
Okay, so I went to Google and typed MNFI. Now there's a couple MNFIs. There used to be the multinational force in Iraq.
That's not the top one that comes up anymore.
It's not the top one anymore, but I just found another one, which is a fundraising Minnesota initiative for fundraising or something like that. So generally, if you type in this and this will be the case, you'll get MNFI. So it's really easy you should be able to to find that. And if you go to natural communities, you'll see a drop-down menu versus a lot of different things. And I want to explore a couple of those with you. So if I just click on natural communities, you have these nice little tiles, and you can click under any one of those, and you can view the natural communities it'll tell you about, and there'll be these resources here. So I'm going to start with one of the early ones, and this is a PDF that's 300 pages long, 300 and some. It describes each of the natural communities and has a key to the natural communities as well. So it goes through each of the communities and gives a nice like a 3-page description of each community and a couple useful list of plants, but a couple useful references is what I'm trying to say. Okay, and the field guide is a book that you can order on Amazon.com. So you can order it from MNFI too, or Amazon. And you can see the other books, like the Prairie Fen book, which is a short, like 100-page, lots of pictures. Mainly it's lots of pictures and some text. The Prairies and Savannah book, which is also on Amazon, and this great book on Great Lakes marshes, which is lots. These latter ones are lots of pictures, and well, they're all actually lots of pictures. So those are some of the books, and then you can get to this. This is a group of the palustrian communities. So you can see a little description of that, and then each of them are listed here. But an easier way to find that, if I go back up to the top, under natural communities, you've got the community key, communities by group, and so here, the alphabetical. This is probably the easiest way if you really want to get to it. You can also just type it in Google. You could type rich conifer swamp, MNFI rich conifer swamp, and you've got this all broken down, and you can see the floodplain forest, and that information from the classification report is pasted into here. So that's the text, but it's really nice because you have a map, a distribution map, and you can have it both eco county and ecoregion. So this is Denny Albert's landscape ecoregions of Michigan, so you can see by ecoregion, as well as all the floodplain forest photos. And this is a curated list. There's a curated group of photos. There's not a ton of photos, but there are good photos that help you. And you can download these photos. You can click on any one of those and save it. And so you can have access to all those wonderful photos. And then the other thing that is the plant lists, and this is super helpful. So there was a question about the hemlock. How do I know? Well, if you wanted to go to the hardwood conifer swamp list of plants, print that out and take it with you into the field, or open it up if you've got access to it, through the cell network. You can look at it and use it as a checklist. What I would love to see is this hooked up to Michigan Flora, so all of these are linked, but that's a process. So that would be great if I could click on here if I didn't know what wild sarsaparilla looked like and I wanted to. So unfortunately, that's not hot linked. That would be great, but it's that would mean MSU and U of M would have to chat. So and not fight over football, right? So the plant lists are great. You can print those out and bring them with you, or you can access those in the field for any of the community types, all of the wetland types. There is a link here to Michigan Flora Online. This is a resource that I use almost every day, and you can type the name of any plant, and I'll type a sedge, and you can, if I just typed Carexta, I don't know how to spell it, I can have all the Carexta. And here's Carextrillis. This is a great fen species. This is in our prairie fens and our northern fens. This is a really good indicator of high alkalinity conditions, and I can see where it occurs. And there we go. And I can see what it looks like, some photos of it. So that is Michigan Flora Online, another great resource. And USDA Plants Database also has pictures. So you have these plant lists, as well as links to Michigan flora. And then the other big resource, there's also a glossary of terms that are used in the book, places to visit. It's not completely fleshed out, but it's a nice resource. And then natural community abstracts. Now they can be accessed here, or they can be accessed under publications, under the abstracts, natural community abstracts, species and natural community abstracts. So there's abstracts for most of the rare plants and animals, or many of the rare plants and animals, and 55 of the natural communities. So these are really wonderful resources, because they tell us a more detailed story. When we first started writing them, we were trying to go like no more than 5 pages, 4 or 5 pages. And as we continued to write them, they got longer and longer and more detailed, and more fun to delve into. So this one's probably, I'll bet you, Josh Cohen wrote this, and it's probably close to 20 pages. The abstract citation is at the very end, and 21 pages. So it's a long abstract, but it goes into great detail on all kinds of attributes. So today's talk was very much a survey of, was like a quick survey of each of these systems. You know, the flip side is, and I do this in my teaching, I go into great detail on each of these systems, and you know, it's a different approach. So, but they're quite fun to dig into if you have, you know, an hour to sit and read, which many of us don't anymore. But yeah, so they're structured with landscape context and natural processes, and it describes why it's ranked. So this is the rank justification, which is the only place where we really describe this. Why is it ranked S1, S2, or S3? And we also cover like this, so it occurs throughout the Midwest or in these states. And then it's cross-referenced to, so NatureServe, I mentioned NatureServe early on. NatureServe is the network of natural heritage program that rolls up the data from MNFI with the other states to assign a global rank. And they've put together, with the support of all the heritage ecologists, in other words, throughout the network, like I was an ecologist with MNFI, and Josh Cohen, an ecologist with MNFI, Denny Albert, Brad Slaughter. So those, we contributed information to build a national classification of vegetation across North America, and that is referenced at the very end here. It's kind of technical, but it's through NatureServe. So it's not calling it a rich conifer swamp. It's calling a Thuja occidentalis, which is the Latin for northern white cedar mixed with, you know, mixed with speckled alder. So anyway, so this is information that ties the natural community here at classification in Michigan, this system, this element, to a broader group, so that NatureServe can, and this is used by the US government as well, look across the range and understand what they've got. Because while we're calling it a rich conifer swamp, someone in Wisconsin might call it something else. So for example, our prairie fens in Illinois and Wisconsin are called calcareous fens, right? So different states are using a common name, and different common names, which can be crosswalked. I mean, you can talk to folks and you can figure out, yes, I have that. Well, NatureServe has really worked to do that. You're calling it this and I'm calling it that. So you can go to NatureServe's website, and NatureServe Explorer is what you want. NatureServe is the organization. Their vehicle for searching, to access the database of what they have and get information on each of these, the detailed information. So not their organizational website, like who's working there, but their what, if you want to know something. So you could type in, see if what happens here. I'll type by Latin name in a minute, but I'm just curious. And ecosystem. northern white cedar, Thuja occidentalis, and I'm looking for the, I don't want the species, I want the ecosystem. Oh, I turned it off. Okay, sorry. See these buttons there? I just turned it off. Okay, so here it's going with hemlock, and here with bulrush, and here. So I'm going to look for the one that these are all, a lot of these occur in Michigan, but so it's Latin, and you can, I think you can also do it with conifer. But someone asked about the hemlock, so let's see if we've got this is a system. G3, it goes through a nice, like a short abstract, and then it'll tell you the states, Michigan and Wisconsin and Ontario. So this is this system is probably our hardwood conifer swamp. And someone asked about that. Like I covered that system, and how does it differ from cedar swamp? Well, this is essentially our hardwood conifer swamp. So this is pretty technical, but some of you are, I know that we have our audience is composed of professionals who do this for a living, as well as people who are interested in conservation and species as an avocation and for personal interest. And so for those, this is a little techie, but it's a nice resource. NatureServe, that's the network of natural heritage programs, who's rolling up all the data from MNFI and the other programs, and this NatureServe Explorer. You can use this for rare species as well. Okay, so let me see if there's any other resources that I wanted to share. The book that all those diagrams from, I have it in there, and it's Don Reed and Edgar's book on Minnesota and Wisconsin wetlands, and that's a nice resource that's free online. I own the book, but now it's out of print, so they've made it available online. That's a great resource. And then the DEQ is also, or I'm sorry, EGLE, Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. They've changed the name a few years ago, so I'm a little slow in getting there. But they have a nice, let's see, can I click on that? It was live, but let me see. Yeah. Okay, open link. They have a nice site on wetlands that has a lot of technical information, a lot of very good information as well, including you know, how are wetlands identified, and so information on permitting and other things. And for those of you who are in the more technical side of things, you know about the wetland delineation manual. So that's available right through their website. I think that's not the greatest link, but the Wetland Midwest Regional Supplement, there we go. So this is a nice manual so the pictures I pulled of the soil with the iron modeling and the blue clay, the glade clay and the depleted matrix were from here. And this is a technical manual on wetlands as well. So that's available. The link is right there on the wetlands, available through the wetlands site. So there's lots of good resources through EGLE. And I think if you typed EGLE wetlands, you'd find the link easy enough. Okay.
Mike, that's great.
Okay. Any other, I'm happy to answer more. I'm happy to stick around and answer questions or show more resources. That's
great. Let's drop a couple questions in here. Okay. There's one that was entered online, so we'll come back to it, about woody peat versus sedge peat. So thanks, Steve, for answering Elizabeth's question. Another one is from Robert. Is there a good way to differentiate a rich conifer swamp from a hardwood conifer swamp? The herbaceous layer, the soil type?
Vegetation. So, okay. So the rich conifer swamp is almost exclusively dominated by cedar. Cedar, it doesn't allow a whole lot of competition. It's a really dense, thick canopy. So yeah, so it's vegetation, but it's cedar dominance. And a hardwood conifer swamp is a really mixed canopy. Could be cedar, but mixed with hemlock and white pine. So on that GLO map, the Am I still sharing my screen?
You are still sharing your screen.
Okay, so on that GLO map, let me go back to, I'm going to find resources and circa 1800 vegetation. So this is a nice resource. So you don't have the whole map here. You can do, the map is available as a digital data layer, and you can use ArcGIS Online or ArcGIS for those of you that use that. But you can also go to, and that's what this go to map viewer is. It brings you to ArcGIS Online where you can do all kinds of cool things. But if you just want a PDF, you can type in any county. So let's type in Baraga County. Oh, Baraga County's in 2 because of the its shape. So Chippewa's in 2, Delta North. Oh boy. So we'll go with Baraga. Let's just go with Baraga North. So, okay. So here is the circa 1800 vegetation. And you can see town range and section, which is really nice. You can zoom in on, you can download this as a PDF, open it up, and then you can zoom in. And each one of the, each thing with each vegetation type with a check means it's somewhere on the map. So you can use that to help differentiate colors. So yeah, that's a nice resource. This will bring you to the ArcGIS Online, which is a really nice, I'm not going to log in. I have an account, but I'm not going to log in. But you can see the whole map right there. Awesome, right? And so you can type in wherever you want to go. If you wanted to type in, let's say, Manistee. That might be too hard for me to spell on pressure. Manistee. Okay, we'll go to Manistee County. How about that? And so here, and I want to know what is that? I can click on that and should tell me what it is. So this is a live layer. It's probably still loading, and because usually a pop-up menu would come up here. So pop-up menu, not, but it depends how they structure this. But this is a statewide layer, and you can zoom in. So that's using ArcGIS Online. And the other resource that I think is useful, so this is the circa 1800 vegetation. You can PDF county by county using here or using the ArcGIS Online. And the other resource that I mentioned a lot, and there's many others, but is the quaternary geology map. Like what are, you hear me talk about outwash plains and lake plains, and here in Berry County, for example, what does Berry County look like? Here we go. This is a quaternary geology or superficial geology showing the coarse textured end moraines and medium textured, the outwash plains here, and the ice contact features here. So, so you get a sense with roads to kind of orient you. So you get a pretty good sense. These maps, so both, I want to say something about both maps though, the circa 1800 vegetation map and this map. They're not going to be always perfectly accurate for any pinpoint spot on the map, because you have to think about how their data was collected and how it was made. They're great at a coarser scale. As you zoom in, it may or may not be entirely accurate, because the data for the circa 1800 vegetation map is best zoomed out a little bit, because the data is coming from by square miles. Like what is along that square mile? Where wetlands cross was where we hitting tamarack. Every time we crossed that wetland was the surveyor noting tamarack, okay, tamarack swamp. Were they noting different vegetation? So, and this map was, they didn't put a soil core in and dig a hole and look at, everywhere in the state. They used roads to get information, to go along them and figure out what they have. So it's the course. I just want to let people know that if they're trying to select what's my property, because that's a really common thing to want to do, and I'm guilty of it too. But you have to realize how those were made.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mike, can I ask you a couple other questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So one would be just online for folks, if there are any resources for bog plants.
To buy, you mean to
buy, right? If
there are a few. There's a few, especially in, you can type bog plants in Google and you can get them, and they're out of state. There's nobody in state that's selling them that I know of. So, but there's some that are out of state. You can buy pitcher plant. You can buy a number of things. I think there's a grower in North Carolina. And there's Maryland somewhere. I think it was, there's 2 growers that I know of there.
Okay, Marie, hopefully that helps you. And then Andrew has a question about dewatering. Thinking about dewatering pumping, like typically associated with sewer pipeline construction and installation. The dewatering pumping is temporary during construction and nearby wetlands can be dewatered. Water levels generally return to pre-pumping condition fairly quickly after project completion. Is there a general rule for how long might be too long for a wetland to be artificially dewatered to where the wetland and its life might be permanently altered? I will invite Amy and Ann to jump in if they've got an answer there too.
I don't know. Let me think about that for a minute. I don't really.
Okay. And while you're doing that, while you're pondering, let me also bring this up, remind you all that there's a lot of great people appreciating this series and this workshop. I want to also let you know that this is part of a series that we've been running for the last year plus. So you'll find on that website that we mentioned to you, you will find, which is stewardshipnetwork.org/EGLE. You will find recordings of our past ones that include wetland mitigation, that includes wetland preservation and stewardship, wetland management and climate adaptation, and introduction to wetland protection. So those recordings will all be available on this website. And then this series of workshops happening in September. There's wetlands protection for homeowners as well as for officials. And the 12th and the 15th of September, those 2 are happening online. And then the other 3 are in person, but you can go to stewardshipnetwork.org/EGLE and you can register for those.
Can I chime in on that question? Because I thought about something that I can say that if that wetland were, and I don't remember if it was in the question or not, but if it was organic soil, that could be really problematic because organic soil, partially decomposed plant matter, when they become fully dry, they can change pretty quickly, and the plants rooted in them will likely die because they just don't have any moisture. They get heated up. The peat that heats up really quickly, and so in the plants, the roots would dry out. So most of the plants would die, and the soil would oxidize. In other words, it would become full of oxygen, so anaerobic bacteria can start breaking it down. So in a peatland, that's not a good situation. And in mineral soil situations, I can't imagine it being good to be dry for a long period because of drought conditions, but I don't know for sure. I mean, in situations where you have fluctuating water levels, they're still getting rainwater, so maybe that would be okay. I don't know, but in peatlands, it could be a real problem.
Exactly. So then there's one final question here that let's ask in the remaining just 2 minutes that we have here. Mike, the time has just flown. Michelle asks if a human-made event, so building on this, causes a major change in an ecosystem, such as the digging of a channel between a lake and a Great Lake, exposing new land, how does that affect the determination of the true ecosystem?
So are they asking a natural community?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it means.
It's interesting on sand. So I guess it would depend on where this happened. I think
what it was.
Yeah. It would depend where it was. And I think in dune systems, this happens all the time, not from man-made, but naturally. And we expose in a dune system, you end up with an interdunal wetland. And those things will pop up with movement of sand in Great Lakes water levels. And they'll have the same floristic composition. So they'll have very similar composition. So, and I think in a dune system, it's you'd see an interdunal wetland in where you're moving the sand out. But I guess it would depend on what the context was.
Right, that's right. Amy's chiming in. So Mike, we have 3 hours has flown by. I want to thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge and for all the work that you've done over the decades really appreciate it and really appreciate your enthusiasm for sharing it with us. Great to spend the time and take journeys through the web and wetlands with you. I want to thank you all online for being part of this and for the work that you do in your communities, and to EGLE for helping to sponsor these workshops and promote them, and for the work that you do. Again, remember, there will be, go to stewardshipnetwork.org/EGLE, where you can find the upcoming workshops as well as this recording and the other ones as well. So thank you so much.
And thank you all for showing up. And thank you, Lisa, and the Stewardship Network, and Amy Lowndes, and Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy for sponsoring the workshop, and the Michigan Wetlands Association. So we're all pulling together, and this is wonderful. So thanks for the opportunity.
You bet. Our pleasure.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.